Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to the first Horus Heresy lore breakdown of the new year. Hopefully, it's treating you well so far as we get on with Horus Heresy book number 16, Age of Darkness, the first short story compilation that we're going to be doing in the Horus Heresy lore breakdown. I figured we'd skip the first one because that ship has somewhat sailed at this point, and originally I didn't intend to do the little anthologies, because, well, while some of the stories in them can be very interesting and give some really cool insight, some of them can also be somewhat pointless, shall we say. However, I figured I'm gonna do them anyway, so we're gonna do Age of Darkness, which contains 9 short stories: Rules of Engagement, Lies Due, Forgotten Sons, The Last Remembrancer, Rebirth, The Face of Treachery, Little Horus, The Iron Within, and Savage Weapons. By far my favorite of all of these, by the way, is The Iron Within. That story could have been made into a full book, and it would have been great, in my opinion. But we will start in chronological order with Rules of Engagement, and with this Horus Heresy lore breakdown, I think what I'm going to do is, rather than going through the stories as I usually do and then pointing out interesting things as they happen, I'm going to talk about each of the short stories in turn. That way I won't run the risk of confusing anyone with the, to put it somewhat mildly, scattershot nature of the stories, as they take place with wildly different characters in wildly different areas and often at wildly different times. So, let us start with Rules of Engagement, which describes a large-scale training exercise, I suppose would be the correct term, but the sheer scale involved makes it seem somehow, unsatisfactory, as Guilliman is utilizing the full force of the Ultramarines Legion, along with various survivors of other Loyalist legions, to simulate a massive-scale war across the territories of Ultramar. Essentially, he is simulating an invasion of his Imperium Secundus by the forces of the treacherous War Master, and potentially also forces still loyal to the First Empire. Or Imperium, more correctly. And on that note, the First Imperium. Correct. Because Guilliman is now starting to get into his plans about Imperium Secundus. At this point in time, the betrayal at Calth has happened, and the Ruin Storm has been created. This gargantuan stellar phenomenon essentially made any form of warp travel outside of Ultramar basically impossible, or at the very least unfathomably dangerous. Due to this, all of the Loyalist forces trapped on the other side of the Ruin Storm are unable to aid the Imperium, and with the Ultramarines Legion being the single largest of all the legions, that's a little bit of an issue. Or actually, were they passed by the Word-Bearers at this point? I think they might have been. At the very least, in numbers, I think they may have been. But when it came to just the sheer scope of their territory, nothing could surpass the realms of Ultramar. And again, that's not just in mere legionnaires. I'm pretty sure they were, probably the second, if they weren't the largest single legion. But that, of course, is not the full strength of the realms of Ultramar. There would also be literally billions of Imperial Army personnel within its borders. Now, of course, you can certainly debate the value of Imperial Army personnel in a war between Astartes legions, but you're always going to need garrison forces. And, well, even the most humble of mortal can potentially kill a Space Marine if he's operating a goddamn artillery piece. Not to mention, of course, all of the various logisticals and industrial tasks that the mortals would be eminently well suited for, essentially allowing the realm of Ultramar potentially to outproduce the false Imperium under Horus. It is an interesting what-if scenario if the Imperium had really fallen, and Imperium Secundus had to stand on its own. It's the kind of things that would make a really, really cool alternative history lore series, which is It's something I'm toying a little bit with, because there are some really interesting scenarios that could perhaps be explored in far more detail in sort of a pseudo-large-scale lore series, perhaps something along the lines of the Officio Assassinorum one, which was like a kind of a mini large lore series. Maybe, but anywho, to get back to the point, Guilliman has created Imperium Secundus as a reserve, as a reservoir, a fallback, perhaps? How do I put it? He has essentially decided, in all his vast military knowledge and understanding, that the rest of the Imperium, cut off from the Ultramarines, and with the scale of the betrayal arrayed against him, because, well, I remember the Ultramarines got quite a taste of that on Calth, he has decided that it is extraordinarily unlikely, if not indeed impossible, for the Imperium to survive that war, and I mean, he was right. Without the intervention of various loyalist forces from the other side of the Ruined Storm, Horus would probably have taken Terra, almost certainly, in fact. And so, instead of trying to save what, in Guilliman's view, is unsavable, he instead put his considerable will and might to saving what he could save, that being Imperium Secundus, and to make it as strong as possible to face the inevitable wrath of his brothers, both loyal and traitor. And as a step in the part of this preparation, he penned his Codex Astartes. This massive work that would... how should I was about to say unify/improve the Astartes legions, but that's not necessarily true, not even in Guilliman's own view. Focus the Astartes legions is probably a better term. Guilliman essentially had his whole training exercise as a gargantuan lesson in both how the Codex Astartes could be used and should be used to find solutions to various tactical and strategic problems and scenarios, and also how it should not be used. First and foremost, he implemented the Codex Astartes across the Legion, which meant vast organizational changes on practically every goddamn level. New commanders were appointed, commanders that hadn't proven themselves at that level of command previously. New formations were created, standards were changed, the formation size of assault detachment, and so on, and of course the entire strategic idea of the Ultramarines Legion was also fundamentally altered. Before this, it was very much so the focus on the practical and the theoretical, where each and every officer would develop his own view of the strategic and tactical situation, and then act upon the available information, laying out a constant stream of theoretical and practical solutions to a problem, and then this would be bounced around both his mind and his officers. In the form of the Codex Astartes, it takes this idea and formulates it in a more organized fashion. Essentially, instead of the brainstorming session where it goes like, okay, theoretical, and it goes like practical, and so on, you have this all in book form, where Guilliman has attempted to codify and lay down every single theoretical along with every single practical solution to that theoretical problem. Now, we could certainly debate whether or not such a thing would even be possible even for a Primarch, because the way it is presented is every single Astartes with an eidetic memory is able to learn every single part and facet of this certainly unimaginably vast tome, and then kinda search their way through it in their minds. They take all of the available information and turn all of that into a set of parameters, which is then applied to the Codex Astartes, which then comes up with a scenario. That scenario is then further honed and refined by the addition of further information and whatever else the commander may care to add into that calculation, until eventually a close approximate of the situation is found in the Codex Astartes, after which that situation has, as mentioned, apparently a couple dozen different potential solutions. which the commander can then pick from, depending upon how he views the battlefield at the time, which one he thought might be most effective, and so on. I imagine the book would also have a way of ranking these options, because otherwise you would have an ungodly spiderwebs of potential solutions which would then have to be taken into account in further scenarios. I mean, to put it like this, you have a problem, right? That problem is well, A. So you have discovered A in your codex. It now gives you 24 solutions to that problem. Okay. Now you have 24 different outcomes, which now all become B. B1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc., and so on, until B24. Each one of those now will have a dozen or 24 potential solutions as well, becoming C, 1, 2, 3, blah, 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 blah. You can see how this gets laughably ridiculous laughably quickly. And whether or not even a Primarch would be able to pen such a work, well, I mean, again, we could certainly discuss it, but he did. At least in the fluff, he has created this work. And through the various scenarios he puts his sons through, it seems nearly perfect. It is able to defeat the Word-Bearer's massive high-aggression assault through an incredibly complex plan. It is able to defeat the Death Guard through a series of attritional defensive battles. It is able to defeat the Salamanders in urban warfare, even though the Salamanders are, of course, perfectly well suited to that kind of combat. In fact, it would be pretty much their ideal scenario, just like there was an ideal scenario for the Death Guard and an ideal scenario for the Word Bearers. These lessons were also intended to teach the Ultramarines not only the value of the Codex Astartes, and convince those who obviously were like, nah, there's no fucking way this is gonna work, that it actually was, because of course it would require an extraordinarily rigid obedience to the command structure. If a commander said, this is how you're going to do things, then for the Codex Astartes to work, they would have to do that precise thing, even if they could not see how that precise solution could benefit them or lead eventually to victory. Something, by the way, which would make the Codex Astartes utterly unworkable for any other military force. I know. Any organization of mere mortal soldiers would never be able to act with the kind of self-annihilation, is probably the term I would use, or the destruction of the self, the ability to take your own ideas, your own judgments of the situation, your own experiences, and put those almost entirely aside in favor of a prescribed set of solutions to a particular problem. I don't think you could get mere mortals to do that, 9 times out of 10. And even if you could, the 10th guy would mess everything up for the 9 others. Additionally, these various training scenarios were also intended to teach the Ultramarines about the necessity of sacrifice. There was an example of a garden world, a beautiful world of unmatched natural wonder, which was ravaged by the Word-Bearers, and there was clear indication that the Ultramarines were like, God, we need to defend every last inch of this because all of it's so perfect. We cannot possibly allow the Word-Bearers to take it. But if they were to do that, they would be fighting the battle the way the Word-Bearers would want them to fight the battle. A constant roiling melee, where both sides would be hurling one another at each other continuously through a never-ending long-term engagement. A grinding, brutal kind of war that the Word-Bearers would probably be able to win. And so instead, the Codex Astartes presents a scenario where the natural beauty of Pandor, I think it was, has to be sacrificed in the name of victory, teaching the commanders a very, very valuable lesson that he who defends everything defends nothing, so on. And then finally, Guilliman personally takes command of the Sons of Horus, quote-unquote, and leads a campaign in which he eventually defeats the Ultramarine loyalists who are following his Codex Astartes. Well, because, obviously, Guilliman wrote the damn thing. he would be entirely able to reverse engineer any and all solutions that the commanders would be able to arrive at utilizing the Codex Astartes. He would be able to see the pattern in their reactions, their behaviors, their movements, and go, okay, this is solution 6,536,DB, subsection A14-quantification number, square root of 17, 18. Basically. And then go, okay, well, then I'll respond with another incoherent string of numbers and letters. And this, of course, was all intended to, at the end of the day, teach the Ultramarines that whilst the Codex Astartes could be used in most circumstances, there were still those in which it was not applicable. Because throughout that part of the story, it is very clear that the Ultramarines commanders are following the Codex Astartes now completely rigorously. Like, they are following it to the letter, and therefore Horus is able to counter their plans. And so Guilliman's lesson, quite simply, is, if you are seeing that everything you are doing is getting countered, if you are seeing that every one of the Codex Astartes points is being defeated, then you must move away from the Codex Astartes. Because whilst it is the perfect solution to almost anything, it is not the perfect solution to absolutely everything. A seemingly minor yet very important distinction to make. Whether or not that point had sunk in with Guilliman's sons is another point quite open for debate, but at least he's been able to demonstrate to them the value and the limitations of the Codex Astartes, whilst also hinting that he may have a plan yet with which to defeat Horus. Which is interesting, since this Guilliman has already, to a pretty damn considerable degree, given up on the wider Imperium. Well, it may simply just be an aspect of Guilliman always planning for any and every eventuality, I suppose. As for the short story itself, well, the theme of it, I think, kind of undoes it in the aspect of it just being a good story. Because it seems as if the entire idea is that you are intended to believe that Guilliman has already committed an act of heresy. It's kind of hammered at you like, oh, we're the Ultramarines, we're traitors now, and fighting against the Salamanders and stuff. It is intended as a bit of a mindfuck to confuse you as to the precise course of events, shall we say. It tries to make you believe that this is in a future where the Ultramarines are already fighting the traitors, and also fighting some loyalist forces as well. But it reveals itself too early and too blatantly, and too often as well. It fails because it tries to hammer home the point that, oh, no, this is totally the Ultramarines as traitors, whilst also being less than subtle about its hints that this is all just one gargantuan training exercise. It was an interesting idea, but I think it required a hell of a lot more time to grow and truly fester if it was ever to really convince the reader of what it was trying to do. So, you know, as a piece of fluff, very interesting. As a story in and of itself, it's too short to fully realize its primary literary tool, in this case, the confusion between whether or not this is real, whether or not this is an event, whether or not this is some kind of dream or prophecy, or even just a theoretical dreamt up in Guilliman's mind and stuff like that. All in all, it's a neat little story. Whilst its primary premise could really use some more time in the oven, it does give us a very interesting insight into the Ultramarines Legion at this time, and also into the realms of Guilliman's mind. It also lays the groundwork of how the Ultramarines Legion transitioned into the new formation following the Codex Astartes, which is great, because it's always annoying when major plot points like that just kind of happen off screen, you know? So it's a neat one. It's certainly better than the next one, which is Liar's Due. I won't spend too much time on this one because this is one of the reasons why I was originally quite hesitant about doing the anthologies, because this short story does not really provide us with anything particularly interesting or valuable. It is about an Alpha Legion operative that is wandering around the outer rims of the galaxy, spreading dissent and rebellion and chaos and so on via misinformation. That sounds like a cool premise, but it is just so massively overplayed. It rests entirely upon two seemingly equally unbelievable suppositions. One, that a tiny agricultural settlement on a colony has an astropath assigned to it for no other reason than to act as a glorified radio transceiver, which is ludicrous. Astropaths are pretty goddamn rare and pretty goddamn valuable. To have one just hanging around in a virtually unmanned radio station somewhere to relay messages down to the general populace, I don't know if this is the most spoiled world in the galaxy or just the most wasteful. At the very least, these astropaths should be located within governmental headquarters, where messages could be massaged and filtered before they headed out to the general populace, particularly in a time of civil war. And the second supposition is that there are no other sources of information whatsoever. No supply runners, no trade ships, no rumors, no other astropathic communications, and no counter-narrative created by local governmental structures. When the message that the war is over, that the battle has been lost and the Emperor lies dead arrives on the planet, from the one and only news source that exists in this, well, entire goddamn system, essentially, everybody just kinda believes it. Yeah. It's a neat idea. I like the idea Alpha Legion operatives going around causing dissent, and therefore causing planets to fall to the War Master without a shot being fired, as they say at the end of the short story. It's cool. I like the idea, but it is far too oversimplified. Reducing an entire planetary population to a state of unrest and basically open warfare in the streets, I think is going to require a hell of a lot more than a single bloody radio transmission, especially from a singular source which apparently cannot be refuted or in any way contradicted by any other sources. I mean, I guess you could argue that it was simply the perfect target for an Alpha Legion operative. Ah, the Alpha Legion. See, when the Alpha Legion are done correctly, they are absolutely amazing because they are these deep, complex stories of subterfuge and stealth. Whereas stories like these are nothing more than the Alpha Legion, or in this case an operative, standing somewhere behind the shadows going, ah, ha, 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 just as planned. And that's not anywhere near as good in my opinion. The next short story, however, Forgotten Sons, is a bit more interesting, because it shows a part of the Horus Heresy that we rarely get to see, the behind-the-scenes diplomacy. The simple fact is that the galaxy is a very, very large place, and even if you have several legions consisting of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Astartes, the galaxy's still a very large place, and that's not a whole lot of Astartes per planet. And so, when you're engaged in a galaxy-spanning civil war, there are occasions where it is better to talk your way to victory rather than blast your way there. We already knew that this was happening. When Horus declared his rebellion, many planets declared in his name. This obviously was a part of Horus's greater plan, and a lot of the groundwork would undoubtedly have been laid long in advance. The previous short story was also, of course, about the Alpha Legion sowing dissent in perceived loyal worlds. There clearly was a great deal of grand strategy at play here, and one aspect of that grand strategy would undoubtedly be to convince neutral worlds to join your side, either by convincing them of how righteous your cause is, or if that didn't work, simply convince them that you're going to win. The latter will often work in even more circumstances than the former, in my experience. And this short story shows us one of these diplomatic endeavors, although it's a little bit ruined. There is some really cool back and forth between the diplomats, a pair of space marines who have been crippled to the point of being combat ineffective, who have been dispatched on this mission, which is an interesting choice. I mean, a salamander and an ultramarine, that might seem like a decent option. I mean, a salamander, at least, they tend to be quite nice and fluffy around humans. The ultramarine, well, at least he can probably be counted upon to keep his cool. Well, details. But even so, dispatching warriors to a diplomatic mission is a bold move, certainly, and Horus's diplomat also views it as such. He sees himself at a decided advantage because, well, he's done this before. He's used to it, he knows the tricks. And he lays out a very compelling argument for why this world should join Horus and why the Emperor might have been the bad guy all along. The counter-arguments are lacking, to put it mildly, but, well, the idea here is that the Space Marines will be placed upon the back foot, so fair enough. The problem is, at the end of the day, Horus, or, well, perhaps Horus actually did want to turn this world, but the Iron Warriors, and Petarabo, who were the original conquerors of it, they had other plans. One Iron Warriors operative has been discovered and was eventually put to rest. He had been sabotaging one of the massive nuclear power plants dotted all across the surface of this planet, which was providing them with all of their energy. Presumably other operatives had to sabotage the others, and in the end, despite the best efforts of our two heroes, the entire planet pretty much goes boof. Which ends the dispute quite immediately and thoroughly. This short story, I think, is somewhere between Rules of Engagement and Elias Dio. It's not the best in the compilation, but it certainly isn't the worst either. I think it could have been made much better with a bit more of a focused narrative, a bit more of a contrast on the diplomatic arena, because that was a really, really cool thing, seeing the diplomatic struggles between the two sides, seeing them present their arguments, trying to convince a neutral third party. That's interesting. And turning it into just another running gunfight with explosions, you know, that is, of course, awesome and all that in 40k, and it's the meat and the potatoes of the setting, absolutely, but on occasion, a little bit more of a cerebral approach would be nice, especially as we know this was happening, absolutely. Both sides would undoubtedly see the inherent value in convincing a world to join them and therefore bring over all of its industrial capacity, unbombed, all of its recruitment pool, fully engaged and willing to join your cause, and of course, all of the local infrastructure, as a supply point, as an ammunition dump, as a stronghold, as a defensive measure, and an offensive springboard. A fully intact planet that joins your side out of its own free will is pretty much always going to be more useful than a blasted wasteland, though in this case, the rebels did have another reason for blowing it up also, because apparently this planet, again, was home to some of the super experimental siege weaponry that Horus had ordered, which is odd, because I'm pretty sure that was the planet that had been taken over earlier in the series by Korax, was it? No, not Korax. Not Korax. The other little birdie people, or the ones with the wings, the Dark Angels, yes. They had captured the world, including lots of siege equipment, and then surrendered it to, who was it? Was it Petarabo or Mortarion? I can't remember off the top of my head. Because at that point, they didn't know they had changed sides. Ah, Petarabo then, it must have been. But now apparently there are multiple places that have created these highly specialized siege weaponry. Siege weaponry that was only ordered by Horus in the first place due to a very specific compliance. That doesn't make sense. I think this is probably a small case of a writer slip-up, where the author hears about the massive siege guns and goes like, oh, Horus ordered those for the Siege of Terra? That's awesome! I'm going to write a little bit of a story around that. And not really realizing then that these siege guns were only on a specific planet and had only been produced for a specific compliance action. Against the Greenskins again? It's been a while since I read that book, but it was very specific in that it was for one actual specific purpose. And even then, they were never actually used because, well, they didn't have any need for them. Now, it isn't completely impossible that they would have multiple orders of these guns, but it would have to be, I don't know, an Iron Warrior experiment, for example? Possibly. It might not have anything to do with Horus' siege guns at all, but it's just such a odd coincidence, you know? And speaking of strange coincidences, I think it is time for a commercial break. And after a little commercial break, we have our next short story, The Last Remembrancer, where a particularly stupid and or brave Remembrancer decided that his commitment to truth, to recalling all the events of the Horus Heresy and reflecting them accurately back to the rest of the Imperium, was so important that he needed to travel to Horus, to the War Master, after the rebellion had kicked off, so that he could have a good look at him and make sure whether or not he was truly rebelling. In his own words, he did not see how it could be possible, and therefore he needed to go there to understand. When he arrived, of course, he swiftly regretted this decision because chaos corrupts fast, and the Sons of Horus, which weren't that crazy of a legion just a few, probably months of in-universe time ago, now have no particular issues with answering a question of why should we be following you by having a legionnaire walk up to the impertinent mortal and pull his arms from their sockets. Which seems like a rather petulant response, but hey, what do I know? But luckily for the Remembrancer, the single Remembrancer, and unluckily for all of the people he had convinced to follow him into Horus's flagship, he was the only one allowed to live. Because Horus figured that, hey, this could be fun. Let's show him all of the horrible, perverse, bloody, and monstrous things that I have read in my fancy new religious book. And then let's send him back to Dawn. And that is exactly what Horus did. After thoroughly brain-fucking this poor old man, he dispatched him straight back to Terra, whereupon the ship in which he was dispatched was immediately seized by Imperial Fist forces, who found the single Remembrancer sitting inside of a room, a safe room at the heart of the ship, with no traitorous iconography whatsoever. Suspicious. Yes. The Fists... Suspicious. Yes, the Fists thought so as well, and dispatched him to an interrogation facility, and they also sent word to Rogal Dorn, who found this most fascinating and personally intervened on the Remembrance's behalf, ensuring that whilst he was interrogated, he was not tortured. And that is an important little thing, and a fascinating little thing as well. Obviously, the Imperium already has a vast and well-developed intelligence-gathering system, because, well, duh. And this system does not shy away from using darker means. As, again, should be obvious, if you're running a galactic empire, you probably are going to have to resort to some draconian measures here and there. But sadly, I feel like we don't really get to see enough of this dark side of the Imperium in 30k. There's a bit too much talk about ideals and truth and so on, when, of course, any functional galaxy-spanning empire is gonna have a lot of dark secrets. You don't hold on to that much power without, breaking a few eggs. Sadly, this point also kind of undermines the entire thrust of the short story. The idea is that this Remembrancer has been so thoroughly scarred by everything he has seen, and also convinced that the ideals of the Imperium are dead by seeing them. Essentially, I guess that his point would be that the Imperium cannot possibly fight an enemy like this without sacrificing a great deal of their ideals. Specifically such things as the Imperial Truth, the free spread of knowledge, well, to an extent anyways, which was at the heart of the Remembrancer Order, their ability to go, well, technically anywhere they wanted to. You know, if the Primarchs didn't object, of course, and even they were eventually somewhat overridden in a way, I suppose, with those Primarchs who still didn't want them simply making sure that they were unavailable by traveling to the goddamn edges of the galaxy. But nevertheless, the noble ideals of the Remembrancer Order was the ability, or more correctly, the idea of gathering up all available knowledge and information and immortalizing it while spreading it to the rest of the Imperium. But, of course, as Rogal Dorn also understands, as he says, you can't really have that during an ongoing civil war, especially not with an enemy like Chaos. That is a very good reason why the Emperor kept the information of Chaos away from practically all of his followers, because he knew that the mere knowledge of the existence of Chaos would in and of itself corrupt some. And in this case, this is one of the finest Remembrancers in the Imperium, who has now written a nice big fat book on how Chaos is real, what Chaos is, and why the Imperial Truth is a lie. Obviously, this is something that cannot be allowed to spread throughout the Imperium. The necessity of burning this book is, well, self-evident, particularly during a goddamn civil war, and yet it is presented as a major moral conundrum for Dorn, which, I mean, on the one hand, I guess you could argue that Dorn is more of an idealist than we first thought, but it seems strange to me that Rogal Dorn, of all people, would have such a problem with this. That he would... I get... how to put it? So some of the groundwork for this has previously been laid, in that Dorn is confused as to why Horus has turned, and that Dorn secretly deep down fears that if he truly knew the reason why, then he himself may also have been turned. So a certain fear of the truth may lie at the bottom of this, and then also the higher ideals that Dorn tried to strive towards, giving him a little bit of a conflict, but I don't know. It feels as if Dorn is a little bit too blue-eyed and naive, in my opinion. Nevertheless, it is a very valuable and interesting insight into the mind of Rogal Dorn. How he has his doubts and his questions as to whether or not he is doing the right thing. as to whether or not the Imperium can win this war, and as to whether or not winning the war will allow the Imperium to return to its old ideals, or if the cost of victory will be the sacrificing of those ideals. Even as Rogal Dorn armors the palace, taking down the massive works of art that made up its walls, its gates, and its buttresses, and tells himself that once the war is over, he will put it all back just like it once was, he is not sure he can do that. And he is not sure that he can put the Imperium back together again either. The next short story, Rebirth, is a pretty damn cool one. It doesn't really give us all that much in the way of information, really, lore-wise, but it has a very neat premise. As for the lore of it, a group of Thousand Sons return to Prospero, unaware of what has happened, and start piecing together what happened to Tisca and their homeworld. They find the remnants of Space Wolf armor, and they get attacked by a force of unknown Adeptus Astartes. The Thousand Sons leader gets subdued and dragged off for interrogation, where at first he thinks that he is being interrogated by one of the Sons of Russ. And he tries to utilize his psychic powers and his skill in reading people to manipulate his interrogator, to knock him off balance. This is a very interesting little play between the two, and it is written in a fashion that really gets this point across. That the Thousand Son is dancing on a knife's edge. He is deliberately antagonizing his interrogator in an attempt to make him drop his guard, to enable the Thousand Son to flee. In the end, this does not work out because he had severely misjudged the nature of his interrogator. And this is where this story does something that a lot of the others try, but fundamentally fail to do. It tricks the reader. The other ones, Rules of Engagement in particular, was far too obvious that it was a training engagement, because the lie was too big, so to say. Oh, suddenly Ultramar is under siege by the Death Guard and the World Eaters and the Sons of Horus, etc. It immediately brings up a lot of suspicion as to what is actually going on. The same kind of goes on with Liar's Due as well, where there are too many seemingly absurd suppositions that we are simply expected to accept, and the twist being that the Alpha Legion is doing this to subvert the Imperium is all too obvious. Whereas in Rebirth, he does it the correct way. He gives you the hints pointing towards the Space Wolves. And so you simply assume, okay, well, I know the Space Wolves attacked Tisca, I know there would be remnants of Space Wolf armor, which they find, and I know that the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves aren't exactly the fondest of friends. And so this hostility, shown on behalf of the interrogator to the Thousand Son, is hardly surprising. The author also uses some very clever and very suggestive language. He describes how the interrogator seems to be in the eyes of the Thousand Sons, how he perceives him to be, while stating very clearly that he can't actually see him. This is his impression of him, and so he gets the idea of a elongated snout with a tongue lolling out of it, for example. Okay, again, that brings to bear the picture of a space wolf. He claims to have seen a glint of discolored grey armor. Okay, that too sounds like the Space Wolves. But he never outright states it. He always frames it as the personal impression of the captive, of the person being interrogated. And since the entire scene starts with him describing how completely and utterly beat to shit he is, you should not take this at face value. But because you have already assumed that it's the Space Wolves who is doing this, you fell very neatly into the trap. It is a far more subtly constructed trap than the others, as the Interrogator reveals himself to be none other than Karn, equerry to the Primarch Angron. What he is doing in this now somewhat remote corner of the galaxy, well, apparently he was fetching a medallion which could potentially be used to contact Horus through some nonsense-bonsense psychic rituals. It's as good of an excuse as any, and it is revealed later on that Angron, or, well, probably not Angron, honestly, when I come to think of it, Karn, probably, on his own initiative, has a bit of a different agenda. Although, I do believe that he, at least himself, thinks that he, in this agenda, is acting for Angron's best as well. Karn is looking for a solution, a cure to the Butcher's nails that are killing his Primarch and, frankly, also tearing the entire Legion apart, even more so than the whole, heretical aspect and things. See, Angron is a Primarch that I have some degree of sympathy to, but also very, very little sympathy for. Self-contradictory, I know, but on the one hand, he could not help being implanted with the Butcher's nails, and I entirely understand that the constant agony of it all undoubtedly drove him, well, completely and utterly insane. But the way he treated his Legion, what he did to them, honestly, even Conrad Curse was not so thoroughly malicious and destructive to his own Legion. And that's saying something. Honestly, if Curse had been placed in charge of the Warhounds, and Angron in charge of the Night Lords, I think the whole galaxy would have been a hell of a lot better off. Curse would have finally received his friends, his true companions, as the World Eaters did everything in their power to try and make Angron appreciate them, recognize them, value them, and he practically never did. Karn was the closest one to get any sort of respect from Angron, and even Karn didn't get much, despite his continued desperate attempts to acquire Angron's approval. And on the other hand, Angron would probably just have killed all of the Night Lords, so benefits all around, really, when you come to think of it. And finally, we also get a very interesting piece of insight into Karn's mind. Now, Karn's a character that hasn't really received enough in the way of fluff so far, but this does a lot to make up for it, because we are given a picture of a tormented man, a man who despises what he has been forced to do, and he really does feel like he has been forced to do it as well, via the implementation of the pseudo-butcher's nails that was made practically mandatory throughout the Legion, and he resents them. By extension, he almost certainly resents his Primarch, but he is fleeing from these thoughts. He's desperately trying to insulate himself from them, because if he ever begins to dwell too long on these questions, what he has done, what he has allowed Angron to do, both to Karn, to the Legion, and to himself, that would probably shatter Karn's ego. He's a little bit of a tragic victim in the same vein as Conrad Curse, but whereas Curse genuinely believed that he was doing the correct thing, and only much later began to question his methods, thereby developing the split personality of Conrad and the Night Haunter, in the case of Karn, he is making excuses for himself. He has not created a split personality. He is instead running away from the questions. Why did I do this? Why did I help Angron? Why did I not stop the implementation of the Butcher's nails? And so on and so on. Because remember, the Emperor himself banned any further implementation of the nails after the World Eaters completely lost it and massacred a rather great deal of people who did not need massacring. And so Khan, being given one last chance at redemption, with 1,000 Sun claiming that he can cure him, and potentially even reproduce the knowledge required to cure the Butcher's nails themselves, probably referring to Angron's own implants, Khan rejects this one last chance at salvation. Not because I think he's evil or because he has accepted the implants, but more because if he turns around now, he's going to have to face all of the missteps he has made. He is going to face all of the horrible decisions he has made. He is going to have to face the fact that he has become a traitor and a murderous psychopath. Blaming the nails for his actions gives him an easy out. It gives him a rationale, an escape, a way of protecting his own ego, essentially by saying, I did not do this, the nails did this. Angron did not do this, the nails did it to him, and so on and so on. It is a fascinating little take on Khan, and I really do hope that he gets a little bit more in the way of proper backstory. Hell, the World Eaters in general, because again, their interactions with their Primarch is really interesting. Preferably, I would really love to see some prequel stuff on this, some tales from the time when they were the Warhounds and not the World Eaters. The next short story, The Face of Treachery, also has another criminally underrepresented legion, the Raven Guard. Though they have received a bit more coverage lately and further on in the Horus Heresy, it really is a shame that so few of the other legions got the kind of build-up that the Sons of Horus got. I mean, for obvious reasons, clearly, since the War Master is kind of the key player in all of this. But it would have been really nice to see a little bit of the Raven Guard, a bit of the World Eaters and so on, before the Heresy. Build them up a little bit, that would have been nice. But, oh well. The Face of Treachery is a continuation of another short story, which I think was in the previous anthology, where Marcus Valerius, the prefect commander of the Raven Spire on Deliverance, received visions, which he would later come to think came from the Emperor himself, about Corax and the Raven Guard being in dire peril. He eventually managed to convince Bran Nev, the local Codex Astartes commander, to take the garrison force of 1,000 Raven Guard and go to the Istvan system. This was an action taken on pains of Marcus Valerius' own life, should his visions be proven to be false. Along with the Raven Guard also came a sizable Imperial army cohort, which was eventually sacrificed as a diversion to allow the Raven Guard flotilla to close with Istvan. Marcus Valerius, however, was not allowed to join his men on this essentially suicidal maneuver. He would stay along with Bran Nev until Corax had been recovered, since Bran, even at this point, even after seeing the betrayal and the catastrophe, apparently still did not entirely trust Marcus. Probably less that he didn't trust that Marcus's visions were true, and more that he didn't really trust the fact that he had a precognitive psyker along for the ride. Those are very rare and very valuable, and yet at the same time also very mistrusted, even in the far more progressive 31st millennium. Using their advanced reflective field technology, the Raven Guard fleet is able to close with the Istvan planet, virtually undetected until they reach low orbit, and deploy their transport vessels to recover Corax and the remainder of his Raven Guard, along with some survivors of the other legions as well. This just as Angron is bearing down on them, as Petaraba has been letting them escape, might be the correct word. Whether or not Petaraba was letting them escape, or if he was simply just being outpaced by the Raven Guard, is a hint unclear. Because whilst Angron bears down on the Raven Guard, desperately fleeing up into orbit, he shouts over an open communication channel that he has promised Corax's head to the War Master, suggesting that his actions were officially sanctioned. Meanwhile, however, a World Eater's battle barge is in orbit and in a perfect position to bounce upon the Raven Guard, who are virtually defenseless in low orbit, taking up the survivors. If this World Eater battle barge were to strike now, in all due likelihood it would be able to destroy the Raven Guard rescuers. And yet, despite starting an attack run, it heaves to, and allows the Raven Guard to collect the survivors and flee. Odd. Very, very odd indeed. And the reason for this strange, extraordinarily un-World Eatery behavior is that the captain of the battle barge, a World Eater of course, had mere moments before been executed via point-blank bolter round to the back of the head by another World Eater's lieutenant, who later claims to be Alfarius. Yes, indeed, the Alpha Legion has begun messing with the traitor formations, and supposedly on the direct orders of the War Master, who has decided that Corax should be allowed to live, that he as of yet has a part to play. This is interesting, however, because would Horus really do that? Why would he let Corax live? We do get to learn a little bit more of the reason behind this later, but a lot of it is rationale that seems to only be available to the Alpha Legion, to Alfarius and to Omegon, rather than Horus. Perhaps, the twins are already working their charms on the War Master, ensuring that their own nebulous plans are allowed to take precedence. It does seem to, at the very least, be suggested during this book, because, again, all of these people claim to have official sanctions for what they are doing, whilst also seemingly contradicting one another and the apparent orders. Anywho, Corax is rescued. The remainder of his legion is brought up from Istvan, and the Raven Guard flotilla is allowed, I believe would be the correct word, to leave the system. Of course, again, we will learn a little bit more about this in an upcoming Horus Heresy book, but for now it all just seems a little bit confusing and nebulous. Why did Horus let them go? What is he hoping to gain? Well, we know in part, at least, that what he is hoping to gain is an infiltrator within the Raven Guard's Legion, because they have, of course, been battered and bruised and abused through their flight through the mountains. A lot of the brothers are carrying armor scavenged from the enemy as well, and company and regimental markings, chapter markings, etc. have all been jumbled up, and obviously nobody really has a solid casualty list at this point in time. It would be very easy for an expert infiltrator to slip in amongst the Raven Guard's ranks, with a pretty damn good chance of not being discovered. I'll leave it to your imagination to try and figure out who might be conducting such an infiltration. As now, I will wrap this first video up here. We'll make this into a two-parter because we still have 3 short stories to go, and one of them is over 2 hours long, so I want to split it up a little bit more. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.